We are very thankful, Lord, to be able to gather tonight as family to worship and to pursue you. And I'm very thankful, Lord, for the love that we have towards you and the hunger that we have towards your word. So I pray, God, that our hearts would be open to your word, that your word would be opened up to us this evening. And we love you, Lord, and pray in your name. Amen. So last week in verses 23 through 25, the last feast that we covered was the Feast of Trumpets. And we kind of discussed how the Feast of Trumpets, essentially, they went off 10 days before the Day of Atonement, which was their high and holy feast day of the year, what we discussed in Leviticus chapter 16. They move in this section for the Day of Atonement. They move through this piece a little bit quicker. So I guess for the additional information that's going to be absent from this chapter, I would encourage you to review your notes from Leviticus chapter 16 for this section. And we kind of understand the purpose of the Feast of Trumpets. Again, that's a little section for the Feast of Trumpets. In Numbers chapter 29, verses 1 through 6, it'll give us the list of the offerings that would take place on the Feast of Trumpets, but it almost looks like an alarm or a warning that something is going to be coming within 10 days. We discussed it a little bit last week. When I know that I have to be at work at a certain point in time, or I have a date that's coming up, I don't just set one alarm. I have a very ugly habit of turning off my alarms. The problem with my phone, the alarm portion of it, you either swipe it one way or the other way. One makes it quiet for a few minutes, one makes it quiet for the rest of the day. Just something in my finger likes to make it quiet for the rest of the day, and I'm going to make sure I get my beauty sleep. That's why I set 15 alarms on my phone to make sure that I don't miss that time. On top of not making sure that I'm not going to miss my deadline, should I come to on my first or second or third alarm, it gives me plenty of time to prepare for my day and to be out the door to do the things I need to do. Essentially, we have the same thing in the Feast of Trumpets. The trumpet goes off, and then they have that time of recognition, that 10 days before the next feast. And that's where we're going to pick up in verse 26. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Also, the 10th day of the 7th month, Tishri, shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. That list of offerings, again, is in Leviticus chapter 16. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who and any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. So this was what we discussed in Leviticus chapter 16 when we had the concept of the two goats. One ended up being an offering, and the other one was essentially the scapegoat. So remember, one was offered up. One had the blood of the sacrifice put on the goat, and then it was sent out of the camp, and they kind of watched it, or set up these little connecting files just to make sure that that goat was going where it was supposed to go. This was their high and holy feast day. So we see, just like we do on a great deal of the feast days, no work was supposed to be done on the feast day. When we opened chapter 23, we talked about these feasts being a matter of gratitude for what God has done. And we see a great deal of these feasts, these eatings, and these gatherings, and we see kind of this joyous concept. When it says here that you're supposed to afflict your souls, how Wearsby puts it is it's a day to really get serious about sin. This is a day for fasting, not for feasting. And that's kind of a hard one, not just for where they are, and a lot of people do have a hard time with the the interpretation of the rendering of what does it mean to afflict your souls, we're going to see in verses 29 and 30 that it's something that's either seen by people or it's something that's especially mentioned in verse 30, it's something that's seen by God. It's easy when you get into this loop of just being busy or being distracted, you don't consider your sin. So really what we're dealing with is a feast or a feast day of repentance. Repentance in that look at your relationship with the Lord, and also repentance in that look of your relationship with other people. And he says, you shall do no work. You're going to have that concept in verse 29, that affliction of soul, recognition of sin, and we see it stated more than once. There shall be no work done on this day, and I always kind of found that fascinating. One, the concept of that day of atonement, no work. We see the concept of atonement, and what we see expounded upon in the New Testament, the work of grace completely separated from works. But it's also the concept that it's more important than work. Obedience to the Lord being more important than their work. So they're called to put all work away. You shall do no manner of it, and it will be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings, what verse 31 tells us. Verse 32, it shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So it starts with fasting, but it ends with feasting. So they have those 10 days of essentially consideration before they come to the Day of Atonement. Then you have the day, and you have your days of your fasting. But you remember on that last day that we discussed in Leviticus chapter 16, you have the 2 goats. One is offered, the other one is set out as a scapegoat. And as soon as the scapegoat, as soon as that concept of sin being removed from the camp, then they went into their feasting. Verse 33, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, again, a holy gathering. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. To offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, and besides all your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord. So we have the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. And what they are demonstrating gratitude for is essentially this is that feast that points them back to them being protected and provided for during relocation. He will continue into that one once we get closer to verse 42. But you remember when they had the Exodus and they left Egypt, before they came into the Promised Land, they were dwelling in tents. I had another note there, but I forgot what it was. So on the first day they will have a feast. On the 8th day they will have a feast. There's a couple of interesting points in here, one being biblical and one being more traditional. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, starting in verse 10, every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles, they would read through all of the law. And something else that was fascinating as time kind of went on, especially when we get to John chapter 7, the priest would take water. Again, this is something that's for remembrance or memorial, showing that gratitude for what God has done, talking about the protection and being provided for during relocation. So that's kind of we can see, or we remember as we went through Exodus, all of those things that God had done to provide for us. Some of them we're going to get into a lot more once we get into the book of Numbers. We remember the manna. We remember the quail. We remember the waters that were turned. We remember the water that was coming from the rock. So what the priest would do is he would go down to the pool of Siloam, get a pitcher of water, take it back up to a small basin that was at the base of the altar, and they would pour water into the basin and essentially say a prayer or a small song that's based off of Isaiah chapter 12. And that's found in verse 3. Therefore, with joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. And in John chapter 7, in verses 37, on the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. The only reason I really point out the second one, especially since it was more of a traditional thing, it's just really neat when you see aspects as a foreshadowing or as a type in the Old Testament, i.e. the rock. It's like a weird story, isn't it? Why is that even in there? So when he strikes the rock, water comes out of the rock. And then we get all the way into the New Testament and we see Christ liken himself in that situation. It's just one of those things for myself, maybe it's the nerd in me, that kind of just encourages the study. Anyway, verse 39. Also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths. This is kind of a cool feast. What are they doing? Basically, to make it easier for us, their church, for 7 days, they're camping. That's kind of a fascinating concept, a very practical statute to remember and to celebrate the things that the Lord has done. 7 days. And a lot of people get kind of confused on, well, where are they setting these things up at? Some of them set their tents, essentially their booths. They would set up on top of their houses or like a lean-to on the side of their houses. We know that this was a traveling feast, and they would kind of pitch them around and stay there. What do you have to really do when you're camping? You have a lot of time for talk. You have a lot of time for fellowship. You have a lot of time for teaching. And we're seeing in verse 43 that this is something that's going to be taught down through the generations about how the Lord had provided for them in the wilderness. I really like how some of these concepts are kind of mixed together. Because you notice in verse 40, the end of it, it says, you shall rejoice before the Lord. Some people read that and they think cause and effect. They're going to do something that's going to put them in a place of rejoicing. In the text, it almost doesn't really seem kind of like a cause and effect, does it? It almost seems like what? It almost seems like a command. You will be rejoicing before the Lord. Now, some of us have a hard time with the command. I don't need to be commanded to be happy when I'm camping. I'm camping. I love camping. I love most of the things about camping. I don't typically like camping for no reason. It's like, oh, we're just going to go camping for a few days. Awesome. What are you going to be doing? Just sitting around camp. I can do that anywhere. Like, what are we going to do while we're out there? Are we going to ride something or shoot something or catch something or set something on fire? Like, what are we going to be doing? Other people will not camp. Not even a little bit. The thoughts of bugs or animals or nature in general or dirt. I love camping with people that hate dirt. So every time they camp, they go to some place that's nothing but concrete jungle. Not even a speck of dust is going to land in their camper, but we go out into the woods. There's dirt everywhere. And then you get all the weirdos on the four-wheelers who like to go ripping up down the road. Now there's more dirt shooting out everywhere, and they spend 90% of their time camping sweeping out the dust. I love the mentality when you divide those two groups. When they were in the wilderness, we haven't gotten that far yet. We certainly will when we get to the book of Numbers. When they were in the wilderness for 40 years, we remember that the older generation, the generation that was in rebellion or in defiance, they had passed, except for two men, Caleb and Joshua. Those were the only two from the previous generation essentially allowed into the promised land. Everybody else going into the promised land, they still have recognition of and remembrance, memory of what God had brought them through. How are you going to remember that thing? We talked about how we have the Spirit and we have grace and peace from God the Father and Jesus Christ, and that grace and peace enables us to function just outside of the situation. We're still thriving regardless of how hard things are. So when those generations had looked back on the last 40 years, living in tents, wandering through the desert, waiting to go into the promised land, what would those memories bring? Would they be bettering the generation, or would they be bittering the generation? The purpose of the feast was to bring them back to a place of memorial and gratitude for what the Lord has done. But I would imagine that for some, especially when we have kind of that command, you shall rejoice, for some, it doesn't really bring a peace. A great example, as a kid growing up, we camped probably twice a year. We didn't do it a lot, but we would drive up to Silver City, Idaho. We'd find a nice flat-ish spot in the mountains outside of Silver City, which is essentially a ghost town, and we would camp. We loved it. We would catch, brook trout. We'd build little forts. We learned how to make fires, all sorts of stuff. Both my brother and I went into the Marine Corps. In the Marine Corps, they also have their own little form of camping. Most military services do. They take all the fun out of it. Every ounce of the fun, they're going to wring it right out. That is a dry mop. We also like to do these fun little things that Hollywood portrays as being amazing, where they do a beach run. We've seen it in the movies where the Navy SEALs or the buff dude or whoever it is running in real life like 10 feet, but shows him running 50 miles down the coastline. And he's so happy and he's buff and and everybody else is having a great time running in the sand. It almost made me hate the beach, which is really hard because I love surfing or just anything on the beach. It's the beach. My brother, however, won't even look at the sand. We'd come down for a visit and I was like, you know what? We're a part of a club. Come on down. We're going to go camping on the beach. We're going to go surfing for a couple days. It's going to be great. He's like, nope, I will be right here. And that right there was 29 Palms, California. Not far from Death Valley. There's nothing but desert, and there's nothing alive out there in the desert. So when you look back on some of those things, you can see how it might bring up a bitter memory or bring up a memory that would better you. But either way, the command, you shall rejoice for his provision, for God's goodness. That's a hard thing to do. Essentially what we're dealing with is no matter what is going on, when we come to that place of prayerfully trying to set things aside because God is worth worshiping. When we come to church, it's essentially supposed to be happy hour. One of the whole things behind worship is it removes that focus on self and puts that focus back onto the Lord, which should cause joy. I think it was Spurgeon that said happy people should be worshiping a happy God. Kind of an interesting concept. When we come to church, sometimes we're lethargic, we're joyless, we're sad. It's not supposed to be, I'm going to church so I can have sad hour. But often that's kind of where we sit. We forget that very often the concept of rejoicing or joy is a matter of choice, fueled by what it is that we are focusing on. So they have the Feast of Booths. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days, all who are native Israelites. As a kid, I bet some of them were kind of looking forward to that feast. 7 days in a tent with Dad. Verse 43, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of the Lord. So now we see another purpose, especially given in this feast. What is it? That your generations may know. The feasts were also put together to teach the generations of Israel, the kids and the kids' kids, all these lineages of people about the provision of God. Granted, we're not doing it through camping, but what do we have as the church to teach these things to our generations? What do we have established? We have things established nationally. We use Easter to do some of these things. We use Christmas to do some of these things. As the church, we use communion and baptism. But what do we have in the home? What was kind of one of the, just something to think about, what was one of the highlights of the things that God has done in your life? Something that if you could, you would continue to teach it through your children. As a reminder of, this is how God has taken care of me. This is how God has taken care of our family. This is the crazy stuff that God has done. It's a part of your testimony. Do we have anything in place, if you will, to kind of teach that thing? It's also neat to see the concept of the legacies of the families. The thing that we are going to pass down is the knowledge of God. So moving into chapter 24, we have two sections. Verses 1 through 9, further care of the things that are in the tabernacle. This one is going to seem quite repetitive because we have actually covered it twice already. And verses 10 through 23, we see essentially the law being put into effect. So verses 1 through 4, the tabernacle lamps. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the children of Israel that they bring to you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to make the lamps burn continually. Outside the veil of the testimony, in the tabernacle of meeting, Aaron shall be in charge of it, from evening until morning, before the Lord continually. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. He shall be in charge of the lamps of the pure gold lampstands before the Lord continually. So we see the care of the lampstands. We're given a lot of focus on the lampstands. In verses 5 through 9, we see a lot of focus on the bread, the table for the showbread. The thing that just kind of strikes me a little bit, it would be weird, it was weird for me, that as soon as you were come into the tent of meeting, the tabernacle proper, you remember as we went through, well, the end of Exodus, the beginning of Leviticus, as soon as you go through the only doors of the tent of meeting, you had the lampstand on the left, the table of showbread to your right, you had the altar of incense directly in front of you, right in front of the veil. You had the veil of the woven material. Behind the veil, the high priest can only go behind the once a year, you had the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. One would think that the extra focus would have gone to the Ark of the Covenant, because we remember how careful you had to be with the Ark of the Covenant. You remember when the Ark was captured in battle. And the enemy, for some reason now, I can't remember who it was, but the enemy takes the Ark back to their place. They put it before their god, Dagon. And people started getting sick and having physical issues. We're going to leave it there for now. We'll cover it in more depth once we get there. And then what happened to the god Dagon, the idol? It fell down. So you know what, this thing is cursed. So they loaded it up on a donkey cart and they sent it off. Well, eventually they were ready to bring it back, or bring it into Jerusalem. They put it on a donkey cart, to transport it back. It makes sense. That thing is wicked heavy. And they didn't have the Levites there, as they were commanded to do, to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and carry it by hand. That's the whole purpose of the poles. They were going through the rings on the Ark. Well, a wheel on the cart broke, and it looked like the Ark was going to hit the ground. So what did one of the men do? What anybody would do. They put their hand on it, though they were commanded not to, but they put their hand on it to make sure it wouldn't hit the ground. What happened to the guy that put his hand on there? Dunskies. He's dead. I mean, they're all dead now, but like he was dead when he touched it. There's a lot of care. So one would think, oh, well, our primary focus, really, we should be talking about the extra care of the Ark of the Covenant. Or the veil. When the high priest went in, he had to go in with the censer already going. You remember he had to take fire from the altar that was outside of the tabernacle. Then he would go inside, he would put incense in it. It would create this smoke plume of incense before he went behind the veil. And the plume, as we talked about in Leviticus, was going to, just like it does anywhere else, you can put the smoke in the room so that the full blast of God's glory isn't melting the face off the priest. Maybe we should pay a lot of attention to the veil. What happens if the veil rips or falls down and somebody's standing in there that's not supposed to be standing there? Maybe it should go to the altar of incense, which represents the prayers of the saints, what we've also been working through in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. But instead, the first half of this chapter goes into the focus and the care of the lampstand on the left and the table of showbread on the right. And I kind of just love where they're positioned and why it's in there. In verse 2, he says that the children of Israel had to bring oil. And in verses 3 and 4, the priest had to essentially take care of the lampstand, something we also see demonstrated in Revelation chapter 1. The priest wiped away the soot. The priest trimmed the wick. The priest made sure that it was full of oil. Why so much focus on the lampstand? It was the only source of light in the tabernacle. They couldn't just leave the curtains open to let some light in there so they could function. And you remember all of the layers and the thick layers that covered up that tent. There was zero outside light essentially let into the tabernacle. It all came from the lampstand. So he had to continually maintain the source of the light, because it was the only source of light, to continue to function, to continue to minister within the tabernacle. But it wasn't just the priest ministering by himself. Such a powerful concept. It's easy to hang all of the responsibilities onto the priest. Those guys are chosen. Those guys are set aside. Those guys went through the ritual washing. Those guys are the ones with all the fancy clothes. Those are the guys that should be doing all the ministering. And we kind of, if God wanted me to do more, he should have made me a priest. How many people, when they go to, where were we today? We're in a thrift store today. I love thrift stores. There was no checkout. It was self-checkout. How many people have been into some of like the lumber stores, things, not here in town, but in like Ontario? You have to figure out what you want. You have to go through the store and pick out what you want. We understand that part. We're the consumer, we're the customer. When you get to the checkout counter, who's doing that process? We're doing that process too. I have said it. It's like, I'm not going to go through the self-checkout because I don't work here. Like, they're going to make me bag up my own stuff and check out my own stuff. Like, I think somebody should be there helping me through that process. It's easy to hang all that stuff onto one person. It's easy to hang all that stuff onto the priests. But we remember when we opened the book of Leviticus, one of the key things we were discussing as we're moving through this book is it's not one-sided worship. It's not one-sided service. It's not a stale service. Everybody was expected to be active and to be participating in one function or another through this whole process. And we see that demonstrated in the first 4 verses. Verse 5, and you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. So we're talking about the bread of the tabernacle, or the showbread, a.k.a. the bread of his presence, the bread of presence. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 in a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. And you shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, an offering made by fire to the Lord. The bread representing friendship, fellowship, provision, but a reminder of God's presence. The bread of presence. So we see his light, and we see his bread. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. We've discussed already the concept that he's essentially saying with every Sabbath, that it's not supposed to get stale. The relationship with the Lord is not supposed to be stale. Remember, this bread was taken to a holy place, and it was eaten together. That concept of fellowship with the Lord. Fellowship and service, not supposed to be stale. It also demonstrates the desire for constant and proper fellowship. That's quite the concept. Constant and proper. We're supposed to always be in fellowship with the Lord, always seeking fellowship with the Lord, but also because this is a commanded statute. That's what I like more. Because how many of us are fantastic at fellowship? My best friend, which sounds really weird saying it out loud, but I have a buddy. We've been in each other's lives for years. We initially served together as urban warfare instructors. We did that together for 4 years. We got a wild hair and decided, you know what? It would be great. Naturally, we had the conversation without our wives present, but we decided it would be fantastic if we could go to Afghanistan together. That's what we did, except he went first, kind of. He had to leave first, so he went to Iraq for 6 or 7 months. He got home after I switched to a new unit. I called him and said, guess where I'm going? Afghanistan for 12 months. I got a seat. You should come with me. His wife was far less thrilled than mine because he just got home, but he went with me. We deployed together for 12 months. Now we talk once every 6 or 7 months. To me, that's fantastic fellowship. That's how we maintain. That's not very constant. That's kind of the opposite of stale. We're the worst. There's probably someone in our minds right now where we're thinking, oh man, I haven't called that dude in a year. I wonder how he's doing. Would that be the definition of a good friend or a bad friend or just, well, you have to remember this is a commanded statute. What does that mean? God desires that fellowship. He desires that closeness. Not only does he desire the closeness and the constant fellowship, but it has to be proper fellowship. So when it talks about, he said it in order before the Lord continually. It's not a sloppy thing, if that makes sense to anybody. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him, from the offerings of the Lord made by fire, by a perpetual statute, which means it was consistently going. It was never ending. Verses 10 through 23, we're going to see the penalty for blasphemy, or essentially we're seeing the law go into effect, a law that was in place in Exodus chapter 22, I think starting in verse 28. So now the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel, and this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought each other in the camp. Right out the gate, what are we dealing with? We have somebody that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 28, identifies as someone coming out of, you remember that passage, the mixed multitude. It wasn't just the Israelites that came out. We have some that were in either a mixed marriage, or we have some that came out that were just Egyptian, which we're going to see that as we continue through the text, especially in the book of Numbers. They came out with the Israelites. Remember all of these plagues in the book of Exodus that were hitting Egypt, and we see one of the purposes of especially these particular plagues was so that they may know that I am the Lord. Some of the Egyptians picked up on the same concept. None of our 100 and whatever it is deities have ever done this. This is new. This is different. And this is real. We're going with those guys. So someone in that mixed multitude got in the fight with somebody that was, if you will, 100% Israelite. Like his mom was an Israelite and his dad was an Israelite, and they were fighting. Does not say what they were fighting over. A lot of rabbinical teachings say essentially they were fighting over two things: their function, or if you will, their eligibility to have some sort of function within or for the tabernacle and for sacrifices, or where they were putting a tent. Again, that's more of a speculation note than anything, but they got into a heated argument. Verse 11 shows exactly how heated it is. The Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. So in some function, in some way, he blasphemed the name of the Lord. Blasphemy is essentially when you attack with words. Something we've been working through in Revelation chapter 13. On his head was a blasphemous name. He blasphemed God. He blasphemed the tabernacle. He essentially blasphemed the heavens. And he blasphemed those who dwell in heaven. He was attacking all of that with words. Words are huge. What does this look like in the text? It could be that the Israelite had made the other individual so angry that it caused him in some fashion to curse the name of the Lord. Or it could cause him to essentially curse God, much like they would do with their Egyptian deities. They could curse their deities, and what would happen? Nothing. They're just idols. We see when there's a transgression or the recording of a first significant transgression, that a very harsh penalty is dealt out initially. You remember with Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts. They saw one individual give everything that he had just so he could follow the Lord, just so he could pursue the Lord, just so he can go out and just share the gospel. And everyone essentially was like, oh, that guy did a great thing. So they did the same thing, except they kept a portion back for themselves, but told everybody. And we see the death of those two individuals there. We're essentially going to see the same thing here. Or he was trying to use the name of the Lord to put a proper curse onto the Israelite. Either way, it's recorded for us as blaspheming, and they took him to Moses. Then they put him in custody that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. So I guess the first big point here, and context is really important for the rest of this chapter, this isn't mob control. This isn't the mob executing their form of justice. This isn't the mob mentality being allowed for a thing. They see blasphemy against the name of the Lord, and they're giving a very specific command in Exodus 22 that individual is supposed to be killed off from the camp. You remember in Leviticus 9 when Nadab and Abihu offered the profane fire. Day one of the opening ceremony of the sacrificial system, 2 priests are killed. So you can see how that would cause there to be quite the seriousness. So they arrest the man, they take him to Moses, but they take the situation to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses, "Take outside the camp him who has cursed, then let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him." So from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, we will be there, this time 2024. But essentially to pronounce this type of judgment, this type of execution, it required at least 2 witnesses. So the concept of this verse is those witnesses, those people that heard him, those are the ones that are going to lay hands and escort him outside the camp. "Then you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, whoever curses his God shall bear his sin," meaning he has nobody else to blame. That sin is on him. "Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. The stranger, as well as him who is born in the land, when he blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. Whoever kills any man shall surely be put to death. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. Whoever kills an animal shall restore it, but whoever kills a man shall be put to death. So not only is Moses, again, this is the Lord speaking directly to Moses. Moses being that representative of the law. We're given this section not only what to do with the man, but what has also been kind of grouped up into what we know as lex talionis, or the law of the talon, or the law of the hand. It later became known as the law of retaliation. The problem with this section, how many of us have heard this taken out of context? Well, he poked me in the eye. I have to poke him in the eye. It's my right. We've heard that one taught. For starters, this section was more for whom? The judges, to make sure that crimes are punished in proper proportion. So if someone pokes you in the eye, it's not a good reason to break his leg. So they make sure that everything is kept in proportion, especially for the judges rendering their judgment. But it's also important to see that this is not a command. That's how we wield this verse typically. If he does something, we're going to elevate it up to the next level. It's not a command, it's a limit. Again, in proportion. How many people see this as a weird left turn? Lord, this guy has blasphemed your name? You had said something before that he's supposed to be taken outside the camp and stoned or killed. What do? We see the question answered, and then we see something weird. We're talking about a man blaspheming the Lord. Now we're talking about verse 18, whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. How many people see that as not fitting the text? I feel, or I think, I believe, the reason that this is in here is because we're going to extremes, as we would see an extreme. If someone says something dumb, and we have it in our culture now, if someone says something dumb and they end up getting shot for it, or how many like telephone tough guys or like guys like pick fights over the internet? It's like, you know what, if we're in person, he wouldn't be running his mouth, then I'd just shoot him. We see this great big extreme over words. The concept of him blaspheming may have seemed extreme to some or appropriate for some. That concept of or sin, let's just talk about sin. Who thinks, you raise your hands. In fact, probably not a good idea. But we typically see maybe the concept of homosexuality. That is top of God's list. That's going to be the first punishable, like most heaviest punishable sin. And a lot of churches believe that that is going to be the worst sin. Some people see it as maybe something else, harm to a child. Or some people might see it as, well, I watched a movie that I'm not supposed to. It's like, well, you can do a lot of these things to equal up to this one thing. We have this weird scale of how we believe sin should be punished. To some, this concept of blasphemy. How many people don't see watching a rated R movie because it has nudity? How many people just don't see that as a sin? I was coyote hunting with a buddy of mine a few years ago, another pastor. He wanted to come to Idaho and he wanted to shoot coyotes. So I was like, perfect, I had a great spot. And it was a great spot because it always produces coyotes. I don't know what it is. Had our calls out. That coyote came up, huge dog. Presented himself at 80 yards. And it was semi kind of turned away from us. It's like, I'm the greatest guide ever. Like, that's not going to happen again. So I look at my buddy, and I gave very specific instructions. When you see a dog, turn off your call, because it's electronic, Turn it off, because he's going to see it at that distance. It's going to spook him, and then, shoot him. So he's bearing up. I'm just watching him. It's like, dude, are you going to shoot it? Like, he's not going to sit there all day long. He's going to catch us at some point. Coyotes are sneaky. His call goes off, scares the dog, so the dog kind of jumps a little bit. He shoots like 10 times, and the dog takes off. He lets an inside word become an outside word. It's not a very nice word. I didn't even notice it. I'm a Marine. Most of that stuff goes whizzing right past me. I didn't even notice. But he was so busted up over the situation. I just looked at him and was like, dude, it's okay. You're a bad shot. Like, I know lots of you guys. That's not why he was so upset. He goes, Wade, I'm really sorry, man. And this is as I was coming into the pastoral ministry. He's already been there for probably 15 years. And he's like, I think I said a bad word. I was like, what? What do you mean? He's like, I'm pretty sure I said the F word when I knew I missed that dog. And I was like, okay. And it like completely ruined his day. But to me, it's like, get over it. I'm fine. Besides you being a bad shot, you're fine. Everybody's fine. Let's just move on with our day. But it absolutely wrecked him. How many people have no issues watching rated R movies at all? You bear no conviction under it. I'm not passing any judgment from the pulpit or, chair. Some people have no issues watching a rated R movie. To other Christians, they're absolutely flabbergasted, and they'll come out the gate with, there is no way the Spirit of God resides in you because you're watching this rated R movie. So we can see that very interesting spectrum of how certain people view sin. To some, it would be easy to look at the situation, oh, he kind of used the name of God or something to deal with the Lord in a way he probably shouldn't have, and now he's going to be put to death for it. I wonder what other things you could be absolutely put to death for, and it'd be easy to put different stipulations on the law. It would also be easy for someone who's looking at the situation several paces from the outside of the situation. We get that a lot too, don't we? And we pass judgment or assume a certain mantle of judgment or a view of judgment. So I believe that's why we have that here. So verse 22, love this passage. You shall have the same law for the stranger and for one from your own country, for I am the Lord your God. So first he establishes there is zero partiality when it comes to the judgments. Zero partiality when it comes to executing these pieces of the law. That part we get. The interesting thing is it says, for I am the Lord your God. It's neat when those are tethered to certain commands or certain pieces of the law. Essentially what is being demonstrated there is they're used to not executing judgment that way. We've kind of seen that one. Well, that's a local guy. He's going to be treated differently because it's one of our own, but this wacko that's, from Washington or California or Idaho or whatever else, like, oh, this guy, we're going to teach him a lesson. We're going to use this guy as an example. He's saying, I am the Lord. You will show no partiality in my law or the execution of the law. Verse 23, then Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and they took outside the camp him who had cursed, and stoned him with stones. So the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded. I love what's in the text. What is in the text? Verse 23, then Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and they took him outside the camp and stoned him. So what is in the text is exactly from verse 13. The Lord spoke to Moses. The thing that the Lord gave to Moses is what Moses gave to the people. We know that's the case because from verses 14 through 16, they're doing exactly what God had commanded them to do. I love what's in the text. Moses received from the Lord, and that is exactly what he transmitted to the people. I really like what's not in the text. What's missing from the text? Intentionally, I would add his feelings, his emotion, his opinion, Moses's. It's missing from the text. Man, how did Moses feel about that? Anybody who's ever tried to do any discipline to a child, moms and dads, sometimes we're the worst. Sometimes Megan is executing judgment. That sounds harsh, but she's like disciplining a child, one of my children, not somebody else's child. Like that's their own business. So when she's getting on Cy, and the whole time I'm kind of in the back, I'd have done it too. I don't say it because that's the surefire way to incur wrath. It's like, what's the big deal? He kicked a cat. It's not my cat. Like it's your cat. Your cat was standing there. Being a dumb cat, I'd have kicked it too. Or when she looks at you for, one of my favorites. I really wish these weren't like recorded so much. But she'll look for help. Parents should discipline together. United front, all that bit. We're parents. We get it. She's like, say something. Don't get caught. Sometimes things seem harsh, especially when it comes to discipline, because we have bleeding hearts. I don't mean to say that in a derogatory way, but we have some people within the body of Christ, God bless them, because we absolutely need them to have a heart of compassion, a heart of mercy. It's like they're the ones you don't put in charge of the money. It's like, oh my goodness, he needs this. No, he doesn't. You're out. You, angry guy, you're in. I'm messing myself up. Back to context. It's easy for someone else to look at the situation like, what he said wasn't that bad. Isn't God being too harsh? We see none of these opinions, none of these things in the text. We see this is direct revelation from God. This is what he desires. This is what is going to be given to the people. No more, no less. But we don't like it. That's the problem. We have problems with the gospel. Even some of us in here. Because there's some harsh things in the gospel. There's some harsh truths in the gospel. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? You're spiritually bankrupt. Blessed are those who mourn, mourning over their sin, for they shall be comforted. If we don't recognize the concept of spiritual bankruptcy and we're not mourning over our sin, you are not going to be comforted. You're not going to finish the rest of those little steps that are given to us in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. We see the harshness in the text. So we have a choice. Do I water down the text? Do I remove some of the sting? Take him out and just hit him with some sticks. Or do something else. Is the blaspheming really that bad? It's not like he was kicking his cat or whatever else. So we have this idea, well, if I make it easier, if I water it down, it's going to be more receptive. This is a harsh message. Because there was probably people that knew that guy, like his mom, or his dad, or his friends, or just someone's like, that Israelite guy, that dude started it. It should be on him too, which is probably why we have whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. He's responsible solely for his sin, his actions. Moses did not water down the message because we see the result of the message. My friends, don't be afraid to give the message, as long as it's a biblical one, a spirit-inspired one that glorifies the Lord, i.e. the truth. If you're worried about the outcome, you should be more worried about your tongue. It's God that causes growth. It's God that brings conviction. It's God that brings salvation. The only thing you're doing is carrying a message. If you water down the message, mark my words, you water down the outcome. You cannot do that and expect to be glorifying the Lord and expecting blessings to be raining down upon you. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for the evening. Lord, I am very thankful to be studying the feasts. And it causes me to really consider the things, Lord, that you have done in my life, that I get to pass down as testimony to my children of your goodness, of your grace, of your mercy, but also, Lord, of your sovereignty and of your holiness. Thank you, Lord, for reminding me that I should be rejoicing, because we have you and you are not going anywhere. So I pray, God, that your word would resonate within us this evening. And we love you, Lord, and we praise you. And we pray in your holy name.